Ethan Brooks ripped the car door off with his bare hands. Not metaphorically, not with tools, with raw, desperate, bleeding hands while the SUV in front of him was on fire. He didn't stop to think. He didn't call for help first. He just ran toward the flames with his 8-year-old daughter asleep in the back seat of his car, 20 feet away. That one decision made in 3 seconds on a rainy Tuesday night would cost him everything he had left. And then give him back something he never knew he'd lost. Drop a comment below with the city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. And if it hits you the way I think it will, subscribe. You won't want to miss what happens next. The rain was the kind that doesn't fall so much as press heavy, relentless. The kind of rain that makes a man feel like the sky itself has given up trying to hold things together. Ethan Brooks had that in common with the sky tonight. He merged onto Interstate 40 just after 11:15, both hands on the wheel, eyes dry from too many hours under fluorescent warehouse lights. The wipers slapped back and forth like they were arguing with each other, and neither one was winning. The defrost was broken, had been since March, so he drove with the window cracked 2 inches, cold air cutting across the left side of his face, keeping him awake. Keeping him moving, that was the whole project these days. Just keep moving. He passed the exit for Riverside first, then the billboard for a personal injury lawyer. He'd seen so many times he could recite the phone number. He didn't have the radio on. He never had the radio on anymore. Not since Sophie started falling asleep in the back seat on these late pickups, because music would wake her, and the one thing in Ethan's life he refused to disturb was his daughter's sleep. He glanced in the rearview mirror. Sophie was curled against the door, her yellow raincoat still buttoned to the top, because she'd fallen asleep before he could get it off her. One hand tucked under her cheek, mouth slightly open. Her dark hair, her mother's hair, fanned out across the headrest, like she'd arranged it on purpose. She hadn't. She never did anything on purpose when she slept. That was the whole beauty of it. Ethan turned back to the road and let out a breath he'd been holding since roughly 6:30 that morning. He did the math the way he always did on these. Drives the private accounting that happened between him and the windshield, and nobody else. The overtime hours he'd logged this week, 11. The extra shifts he'd covered when Marcus called out sick Monday and Thursday, both 2. The number of times his supervisor, Dale Whitfield, had acknowledged any of it, 0. He wasn't bitter about that. Not exactly. He'd learned a long time ago that Dale Whitfield didn't run on gratitude. He ran on whatever kept the quarterly numbers looking clean enough that nobody upstairs asked questions. Ethan made those numbers work. Ethan had always made those numbers work. And Dale had always taken credit for how well those numbers looked. That was the arrangement. Ethan had accepted it. What he hadn't accepted, what still sat in his chest, like a piece of gravel he couldn't cough up, was the write-up from 2 weeks ago. A missed deadline on a shipment that Ethan had flagged 3 times in writing as a problem waiting to happen. Dale had ignored all 3 flags. When the shipment failed, Dale had submitted the incident report with Ethan's name in the responsible party field. Ethan had read the report twice, standing in the break room with his coffee going cold, and he hadn't said a word. Because what was there to say? He'd learned that one the hard way too. His phone buzzed in the cup holder. He ignored it. Whoever it was would wait. Whoever it was could. The explosion of red brake lights hit him before he processed what he was seeing. Every car in front of him lit up at once, a wall of red, stretching across 3 lanes, 100 yards ahead, and Ethan's foot was already on the brake before his brain had finished registering the information. The anti-lock engaged, pulsing under his foot. His right arm shot out across the passenger seat, the reflex that meant nothing, that protected nobody, that he still did every single time. Sophie lurched forward in her booster seat and snapped awake. It's okay. His voice was steady. He didn't know how. Hold on, baby, I got it. The car came to a stop 60 feet back from the pileup. Because it was a pileup, he could see it now too, maybe 3 vehicles. The middle lane was the worst. A black luxury SUV, big, new, the kind with the chrome grille and the rim boards, had gone into the concrete divider at what must have been 50 miles an hour. The front end was gone. Steam or smoke was coming from beneath the hood. Hard to tell which in the rain. The car behind it had rear-ended a pickup truck trying to avoid the SUV, and the pickup had spun sideways and was blocking the right lane entirely. Other cars were stopped at awkward angles, hazards beginning to blink on one by one. Ethan put his car in park. He didn't decide to do what he did next. That was the thing he could never fully explain, later, to anyone who asked. There was no conscious decision. There was just his hand pulling the parking brake and his door opening, and his feet hitting the wet pavement, and the rain immediately soaking through his shirt. "Daddy, where are you going?" He stopped with one hand on the roof of the car and looked back at his daughter. She was wide awake now, pressing her small face toward the window, her eyes large and dark and serious, her mother's eyes. Same as always, same as always. God help him. "Stay in the car," he said. "Doors locked. Don't open them for anything." "Daddy, Sophie," he held her gaze. "What's the rule?" She pressed her lips together, hating it, but she knew. "Don't open the door unless it's you or a police officer." That's right. He reached in and clicked the lock button on the driver's door. "I'll be right back, I promise." He didn't know if that was true. He said it anyway. He ran. The distance between his car and the SUV was maybe 70 yards. He covered it in seconds, weaving between stopped vehicles, holding up one hand toward a driver who'd started inching forward without looking. The rain had turned the highway into something you could barely see across. His work boots, steel-toed, meant for warehouse floors, felt like bricks on the wet asphalt. He smelled it before he saw it clearly. Fuel. Not the background smell of exhaust that lived on every highway. This was sharper, immediate. The kind of smell that meant something was leaking that was not supposed to be leaking. He rounded the back of a stopped minivan and got his first clear look at the SUV. The driver's side door had been driven partially into the frame on impact. The window was gone. Through the open space where the window had been, he could see the deployed airbag, deflated now, gray and limp. And behind it, slumped against the door, a woman. She wasn't moving. Ethan didn't slow down. He grabbed the door handle with both hands and pulled. Nothing. He pulled again, harder, planting his right foot against the frame of the vehicle for leverage, and he felt the metal give exactly 1 inch before stopping. The impact had warped the door into the frame, sealing it shut. He could hear the hiss of something liquid or gas. He didn't know which, from somewhere underneath. "Hey," he put his face close to the broken window. "Hey, can you hear me?" The woman stirred, just slightly. Her head moved. "Ma'am, I need you to talk to me. What's your name?" Nothing intelligible. A sound, not a word. He stood back up and looked at the door again. He'd dealt with stuck mechanisms his whole career, 8 years in warehousing. Equipment that didn't want to cooperate. He knew how metal fought back. He knew where the weak points were. He grabbed the door again, both hands around the edge of the frame this time, and he pulled with everything in his body, his back, his legs, the part of him that had been quietly burning for months without anywhere to go. He felt something pop in his left shoulder and kept pulling. The door shrieked and gave way. Not all the way, not fully, but enough. Enough of a gap. He got his arm through first, reaching across her body for the seatbelt release. He found it. The belt clicked free. Then he got both hands under her arms, and he pulled her toward him, toward the opening, carefully, because he didn't know what was broken, and he didn't have time to find out. "I've got you," he said, because he needed to keep talking so he'd know if she woke up. "You're okay, I've got you." She was heavier than she looked, or maybe his shoulder was worse than he thought. He gritted his teeth and kept moving backward, drawing her out through the gap in the door. Her feet caught on the doorframe. He reached down and freed them. The smell of fuel was getting stronger. He didn't run. Running would risk dropping her, and dropping her on asphalt was not an option. He moved fast as he could, while holding a limp 130-pound woman against his chest, putting distance between them and the vehicle. He made it 40 feet. The SUV caught. Not a movie explosion, no fireball, no shockwave throwing them through the air. It was quieter than that. A rush of orange light from under the hood, then the windows glowing from inside, then the rolling sound of fire eating everything the vehicle had to offer. Ethan lowered the woman to the pavement. His hands were shaking. He hadn't noticed that until right now. She was breathing. He checked that first. Chest rising, falling, rising. A cut on her forehead, not deep but bloody, the way head cuts are, and her left arm was at an angle he didn't like. But she was breathing. Hey, he patted her cheek gently with the back of his hand. Hey, come on. Her eyes opened. They were gray. Not an observation he had time to make. He made it anyway. Gray and dazed, and then suddenly, rapidly, trying to focus. She stopped. What happened? Your car hit the divider. I got you out. He was already looking back over his shoulder. He could hear the first siren, distant but approaching. Help's coming. An ambulance is on the way. She blinked up at him, rain hitting her face, and something sharpened in her expression. Not quite alert, not fully, but trying to be you. She reached up and grabbed his wrist. Her grip was stronger than he expected from someone who'd been unconscious 90 seconds ago. You pulled me out. Don't try to sit up. Your hands are bleeding. He looked down. They were. He hadn't noticed that either. The edge of the door frame had opened a cut across the base of his right palm, and the rain was doing what rain does, spreading it thinner and making it look worse than it probably was. I'm fine, he said. You need to stay still. What's your name? She blinked. Charlotte. Charlotte Bennett. Charlotte. He kept her hand down as she tried to push up again. Charlotte, listen to me. Help is almost here. I need you to stay exactly where you are and not move that left arm. Why not my left arm? Because it might be broken. Okay, can you do that? She looked up at him with those gray eyes, still dazed, and nodded. He heard another car door behind him, someone else from the stopped traffic, approaching now that the immediate danger had resolved. A middle-aged man in a delivery uniform. Phone out, already calling 911. He was the visible part of the response. Ethan understood immediately, from some instinct he couldn't have named, that he was not supposed to be. He squeezed Charlotte Bennett's uninjured hand once. You're going to be okay, he said. Then he stood up, walked back to his car, and drove away. He didn't look in the rearview mirror. He'd made that a rule, too. Sophie was awake and twisted around in her booster seat, pressed against the window, watching the orange glow recede behind them. Is the lady okay? She asked. She's okay? Did you help her? Ethan merged back into the single open lane and kept his eyes forward. His hands were still shaking slightly. The cut on his palm left a faint smear on the steering wheel. Yeah, baby, he said. I helped her. Sophie was quiet for a moment. Then, you didn't give them your name, did you? It wasn't a question. She knew him. No. Why? He thought about how to answer that honestly, the way he always tried to answer her, even when honest was harder than simple. Because that's not why you help people, he said. You don't help someone so they know your name. You help them because they need it, and you're there. Sophie considered this with the gravity that 8-year-olds reserve for things they've decided are important. Okay, she said finally, and then, softer, your hands are bleeding, Daddy. I know. Does it hurt? He thought about the woman on the pavement, looking up at him with rain on her face. He thought about the door giving way. He thought about the sound of the fire. Not really, he said. He got Sophie home and into bed by midnight. He cleaned the cut on his palm in the bathroom sink, standing under the fluorescent light, watching the water run pink. It wasn't deep. It would be fine in a few days. He wrapped it in a strip of gauze from the kit under the sink and stood there for a moment with his eyes closed, listening to the rain on the bathroom window. He didn't feel like a hero. He felt tired. He felt like a man who had a 6:30 alarm, and a daughter to get to school, and a job he hated but could not afford to lose, and who had maybe made one right decision tonight in a year that had contained very few right decisions. And that was all it was. He turned off the bathroom light and went to bed. His alarm went off at 6:28. He was already awake. He'd been awake since 5, lying on his back in the dark, running the numbers again. Rent due in 6 days. Sophie's school field trip payment due by Friday. The water heater making that sound it had been making since February, the sound that meant it was months from failing. He got up. He made Sophie's lunch peanut butter, apple slices, the little cheese crackers she liked, a note he always put in, even though she claimed she was too old for notes, and he had never once seen evidence she actually meant that. He poured cereal, he made coffee. Sophie came downstairs in her blue hoodie. With her hair still damp from the shower she always insisted on taking in the morning, and she looked at his bandaged hand and didn't say anything about it, which meant she understood. "How'd you sleep?" he asked. "Good." She sat down and pulled the cereal bowl toward her. "Then did you sleep?" "Some." She gave him a look that was 10 years older than her face. "You should sleep more." "I know. Mrs. Peterson says sleep deprivation is bad for decision-making." "Mrs. Peterson is correct. Are you going to tell your boss about your hand?" Ethan poured his coffee and considered this. Probably not. "Why not?" "Because I'd have to explain why it happened." She chewed her cereal and thought about this. "And you don't want to." "And I don't want to." She nodded like this was reasonable. Because for them it was. He dropped her at school at 7:45. She jumped out of the car, hiked her backpack up on both shoulders, and then turned back. She almost never turned back. "Dad, yeah?" She held his gaze for a moment. Something in her expression was careful the way she got when she was about to say something she'd been thinking about for a while. "That lady last night," she said. "She's going to wonder who you were." Ethan looked at his daughter across the open car door. "Maybe," he said, "she's going to want to thank you." "She doesn't need to." Sophie tilted her head, her mother's eyes. "Yeah," she said, "but she's going to want to." She turned and walked into school before he could answer. He got to work at 8:11. 8:11. He was aware, pulling into the parking lot, that he was 11 minutes late. He was also aware that in 4 years at Hargrove Logistics Solutions, 812 working days, give or take, he had been late exactly twice. Once for Sophie's emergency appendectomy 2 years ago. And once, 8 months earlier when a water main had broken on the only route to the warehouse, and he'd sat in traffic for an hour and then called ahead to notify dispatch. Today, he had no good reason to offer. He'd sat in traffic for 11 minutes because he'd been driving slower than usual, because he'd had 4 hours of sleep, and he hadn't wanted to call ahead because he hadn't wanted to explain. He signed in, stowed his jacket, and walked directly to his station. He didn't make it there. Brooks. Dale Whitfield's voice had a particular quality, the quality of someone who had spent years practicing how to make a simple word sound like a verdict. He was standing outside his glass-walled office with a clipboard, which meant he'd been waiting. Ethan stopped, turned. "You're late," Dale said. 11 minutes. "Yes, this morning of all mornings." Dale glanced down at his clipboard like it contained documentation of Ethan's crimes. "Corporate audit team is here today. Department heads are expected to present clean operational records." You understand what that means for first shift performance logs. I understand. Your name is already on this morning's attendance report as a late arrival. Ethan looked at him. 8:11, Dale. 8:11 is not 8 o'clock. I've worked an average of... I'm not interested in averages. Dale set the clipboard against his side. He was 52, soft around the middle, with the permanently irritated expression of a man who considered inconvenience a personal insult. I'm interested in today. And today you're late. And today we have an audit. What do you need from me? What I need from you is what I always need. But since you apparently can't manage that... He paused, giving that pause the weight he thought it deserved. I've made a decision. Effective today, we're making a staffing change. Ethan went very still. A staffing change, he said. We're letting you go, Brooks. The words landed the way words like that always land, not loudly, but with a kind of hollow finality, like dropping a stone into deep water. No splash, just gone, you're firing me, Ethan said. We're restructuring the role. It's a business decision. I've worked here 4 years, and I appreciate your service. The phrase, I appreciate your service, was so automated, so perfectly emptied of meaning, that Ethan almost wanted to laugh. I covered Marcus's shifts twice this week, he said. I flagged the Devlin shipment in March, April, and May in writing, with timestamps, and you submitted the incident report, with my name on it. I've worked every overtime shift you've offered, every one. This isn't about 11 minutes late because I pulled someone out of a burning car at 11:30 last night on I-40, and I had 4 hours of sleep, and I drove my daughter to school. And I did not call in sick because I did not want to leave you short-staffed. He heard his own voice, made himself lower it. That's why I'm 11 minutes late. Dale Whitfield stared at him. For a moment, just a moment, something moved across his face. Something that might have been uncertainty, or the distant memory of conscience. Then it was gone. Security will walk you out, he said. We'll mail your final check. Ethan stood there for 3 full seconds. Then he picked up his badge from around his neck, unclipped it from the lanyard, and set it on Dale Whitfield's clipboard. He didn't slam it, he didn't throw it, he set it down with the same quiet precision he'd used for 4 years on every task this company had handed him. Have a good day, Dale, he said, and he walked out. The parking lot was empty of other people. He sat in his car for a long moment without starting the engine. His bandaged hand rested on the wheel. He could feel the cut pulling slightly, nothing serious, just a reminder. He thought about rent. He thought about Sophie's field trip. He thought about the water heater. He thought about a woman lying on rain-wet asphalt with gray eyes trying to focus on his face. He took his phone out. No missed calls from anyone who mattered. 3 texts from Marcus asking if he'd heard what happened at morning shift. He put the phone away. He took a breath. He started the engine. He had a daughter to pick up at 3:15, a refrigerator to fill, and an afternoon to figure out at what came next. The math was not good. The math was, in fact, worse than it had been in a long time. But he'd done the right thing last night. He believed that. And nobody, not Dale Whitfield, not the audit team, not the indifferent machinery of the universe, could take that out of his hands. He pulled out of the Hargrove Logistics parking lot and didn't look back. He didn't know. Couldn't have known that 37 miles away, in a private hospital room with excellent light and a television she wasn't watching, a woman named Charlotte Bennett had already watched the traffic camera footage twice. And was watching it a 3rd time. She was watching a man in a warehouse uniform run toward a burning vehicle in the rain. She was watching him pull a door apart with his hands. And she was watching him disappear into the dark without giving anyone his name. Her laptop was open on the bed beside her. Her broken arm, a clean fracture of the radius, that Dr. had said, 6 weeks in a cast, was immobilized against her chest. She typed with her good hand. She typed, Hargrove Logistics Solutions, I-40 Corridor, night shift worker, Tuesday. She already had more than she needed to find him. What she didn't have yet was a plan. But Charlotte Bennett had never needed long to build one. Charlotte Bennett had not cried in 11 years. She knew the exact date. March 14th, 11 years ago, standing in a hospital corridor in Boston, while a doctor told her that her mother had passed peacefully in the night. She had nodded, thanked him, signed the required forms, arranged the flowers, written the obituary, and handled every single detail without producing a single tear. Not because she didn't love her mother, because Charlotte Bennett had learned, somewhere in the long, hard education of becoming who she was, that emotion without direction is just noise. She cried now, not loudly, not dramatically, just silently in a private room in St. Michael's Medical Center at 7:23 in the morning, watching a traffic camera video on her laptop for the fourth time, one-handed, with her broken arm strapped to her chest and rain still somehow cold in her memory, even though she'd been inside for hours. She watched the figure in the warehouse jacket run across the wet highway. She watched him grab the door. She watched him pull. She watched him carry her across 40 feet of open road and set her down with the careful deliberateness of someone who'd made a decision and was committed to it, no matter what it cost. And then she watched him walk away. She pressed pause. She sat with that image, the man in the warehouse jacket walking back through the rain toward a beat-up sedan, and something happened in her chest that she didn't have a word for. It wasn't gratitude, exactly. Gratitude was what you felt when someone held the elevator. This was bigger than that. This was the feeling of suddenly understanding something true about the world that you'd spent a long time convincing yourself wasn't true anymore. She closed her eyes, opened them, pressed play one more time. Her phone rang. She let it go to voicemail. Her assistant, probably. Her board chair. Someone who needed something from Charlotte Bennett, which was the permanent condition of her life. Everyone always needed something from Charlotte Bennett. Except the man on the video. He hadn't needed a thing. She picked up her phone and called a different number one. She kept in a separate contact list. She titled simply people who are actually good at things. It rang twice. "Good morning, Ms. Bennett," said a voice that was already awake, because James Kowalski was always already awake. He was 61, a former investigative journalist who now worked exclusively for Charlotte as her director of background research. And his definition of a good morning was one where he'd already found something interesting before 8 o'clock. "James," she said, "I need a full workup. I'm sending you a footage timestamp from I-40 traffic cameras. Tuesday night, 11:18 p.m., westbound. There's a man who responds to a vehicle accident. Warehouse-style work jacket, steel-toed boots, drives a late-model gray Honda Civic. I need his name, his employer, his history." A pause. The sound of James setting down a coffee cup. "Accident victim?" "He's the one who pulled me out." Another pause. Longer. "I see." James's voice shifted not dramatically, but she heard it. He had known Charlotte for 9 years. He knew what her voice sounded like when she was making a decision versus when she was asking a question. This was neither. This was something rarer. "I'll get on it now." "How broad do you want the scope?" "Everything," Charlotte said. "Start with the employer. I want to know what kind of company he works for. And if it's not a good one." She looked at the paused frame on her laptop. The man in the rain, walking back to his car, not looking back. "Then that," she said quietly, "becomes relevant." She hung up and lay back against the pillow and stared at the ceiling and thought about what it meant that a man could do what that man had done and then simply leave. No name, no wait for the ambulance to acknowledge him. No pause to see if anyone had filmed it, just gone. Like it had been nothing, like it had been the only possible thing to do, and therefore not worth discussing. She thought she might know what kind of man that was. She thought she might need to verify that. The doctor came in at 9 to review her x-rays and talk about recovery timelines and ask the standard questions about pain levels and support systems at home. She answered all of them accurately and asked 2 follow-up questions about the healing process for radial fractures, because Charlotte Bennett did not accept vague medical information any more than she accepted vague quarterly reports. She was also simultaneously composing a mental list. By the time the doctor left, she had 4 items on it. By 10 o'clock, when James called back, she had 6. "His name is Ethan Brooks," James said, and Charlotte reached for the notepad on the beside table. 34 years old, single father, 1 daughter, 8 years old, named Sophie. Wife died 3 years ago. Breast cancer, stage 4, diagnosed after Sophie was born. He took every available shift during treatment to cover medical bills. The debt took 18 months to clear after she passed. Charlotte's pen had stopped moving. He's a warehouse operations technician at Hargrove Logistics Solutions. Been there 4 years. His record is. James paused in a way that meant the pause itself was meaningful. Remarkable. By any reasonable standard, he's covered more unscheduled shifts than any other employee at his level. He flagged 3 separate operational issues in writing, all of which were ignored and all of which subsequently became reportable incidents, none of which were attributed to him in the company's own public documentation, but all of which were attributed to him in internal write-ups filed by a supervisor named Dale Whitfield. Charlotte wrote the name. "Dale Whitfield," she said. Operations manager, 15 years at the company. His record is the inverse of Brooks's. Numbers look fine on paper because someone underneath him makes them fine, and he takes credit accordingly. Charlotte set the pen down. "James," she said, "yes?" "What time did Brooks's shift start this morning?" A keyboard click. "First shift, 8 o'clock. She looked at the window. It was 10:14. "Call me the moment you have anything else," she said. She hung up and immediately dialed another number, her attorney, Robert Finch, who answered on the first ring. Because Robert Finch understood that when Charlotte Bennett called, time was already moving. "I need you to pull everything you have on Hargrove Logistics Solutions," she said. "Corporate structure, ownership, debt load, operational metrics, outstanding liabilities. I want a preliminary picture by end of day." "Is this the acquisition target we discussed last quarter?" Robert asked. "It was a candidate," Charlotte said. "Pull the file." "Any particular angle you want me to focus on?" "Leadership culture," she said. "I want to know how they treat the people who make them work." She ended the call. She lay back and thought about Ethan Brooks getting up this morning, getting his daughter ready for school, driving to a job where a man named Dale Whitfield was waiting to give him credit for nothing and blame for everything. She thought about what he'd said on the highway. She remembered his voice, low and steady, not shaking even a little. "I've got you. You're okay. I've got you." She thought about the way he'd checked her breathing before he checked his own hands. Charlotte Bennett had built a career on reading people. She had sat across negotiating tables from men who thought they were smarter than her and women who underestimated her, and boardrooms full of both. And in 22 years she had developed a near-perfect instrument for detecting the difference between character and performance. Ethan Brooks was not performing. She knew that the way she knew the difference between a company with good fundamentals and a company with good marketing. She opened her laptop one-handed and started reading the Hargrove Logistics Solutions annual report. She was 3 pages in when James called back. "He was fired this morning," James said. She stopped reading. "What time?" 8:17 based on the HR system timestamp. 17 minutes after his shift started. The termination reason listed is attendance and performance. Charlotte said nothing for a moment. Attendance and performance, she repeated. His attendance record shows 197 days worked without a late arrival over his 4-year tenure, before today. Today, he was 11 minutes late. She closed the annual report. And performance. The only performance documentation on file is the write-up from the Devlin shipment incident. The one where he submitted 3 written warnings that were ignored. James, Charlotte said, and her voice had dropped into a register that James Kowalski knew well. The register that meant the decision had been made, and what followed was execution. How quickly can you get me a complete internal HR file on Hargrove? Employment records, internal communications, the full picture. Through the acquisition due diligence channel? He was already moving. She could hear it. 48 hours if we route through your M&A team. Do it in 24. That will require. I know what it requires. Do it. She hung up and called Robert Finch back. Move Hargrove to active consideration, she said before he could speak. I want the preliminary valuation on my screen before I leave this hospital. Charlotte, Robert said carefully. We discussed this acquisition as a long-term possibility. The fundamentals are worse than their numbers suggest and better than their leadership deserves, she said. Which makes it a value play. Move it. She could hear him thinking. She waited because Robert was good enough that his thinking was worth waiting for. Is there a non-financial motivation I should be aware of? He asked. There's always a non-financial component, Charlotte said. The financial case stands on its own. You'll see when you pull the report. The operational infrastructure is solid. The management layer is the liability, and management layers are replaceable. All right, she heard him writing. Preliminary valuation by end of business. Thank you, Robert. She set the phone down and looked at her broken arm. 11 minutes late, a man who had been awake since God knows when, who had carried an unconscious woman out of a burning vehicle with his bare hands, who had driven home in the rain, cleaned his own wounds alone, put his daughter to bed, woken up 4 hours later, made lunch, driven to school, and shown up. 11 minutes late, and been fired for it. She thought about Dale Whitfield, standing in that parking lot with his clipboard, in his clean shirt, having slept his 8 hours, and making a calculation about what was convenient for him this morning. She felt something clarify in her chest. Not anger, though anger was part of it. Something harder than anger. Something like purpose. Charlotte Bennett had been accused of being ruthless. She had been accused of caring more about the deal than the people. She had, in certain quiet moments of honesty, worried those accusations contained truth. This morning, she didn't feel ruthless, she felt clear. By noon, she had the preliminary valuation. Robert had flagged what she already knew. Hargrove's operational performance was being held up by a small cluster of mid-level employees whose productivity metrics were significantly outperforming their tier, while executive overhead was running 50% above industry average. The company was, in Robert's diplomatic phrasing, leadership constrained. She called her CFO. She called her acquisition director. She called the investment committee chair and laid out the case in 8 minutes because Charlotte Bennett had never in her life needed 9 minutes to make a case that could be made in 8. By 2 o'clock in the afternoon, Hargrove Logistics Solutions had become an active acquisition target, with a projected close win 30 to 45 days. She asked her assistant to send flowers to the nurse's station and checked herself out of St. Michael's 3 hours ahead of the doctor's recommendation. She signed the discharge acknowledgement, initialed the boxes about rest and follow-up care, and sat in the back of her car with her cast arm across her chest and her phone in her good hand, and she let herself think. For 1 full minute about what she was actually doing. Not the acquisition. She knew what that was. That was business, and the business case was real. She was thinking about Ethan Brooks. She was thinking about whether what she was something he would accept, and more importantly, whether it was something she was offering for the right reasons. She turned the question over honestly, the way she turned hard questions, refusing to let herself off the hook with easy answers. She had been nearly killed last night, a man she'd never met had chosen, in 3 seconds and at real personal risk, to run toward the thing that was trying to kill her. He had gotten her out. He had stayed calm. He had held her hand. He had told her she was going to be okay, and she had believed him, because he said it the way people say things when they already know the outcome, because they've already decided what it's going to be. And then he had walked away without leaving his name. He hadn't done it for her. He didn't know her. He had done it because it was in front of him, and it needed doing, and that, Charlotte understood, was the purest form of character there was. Character that had no audience. Character that existed entirely for its own sake. She had spent 22 years trying to find people like that, to build things with. She had mostly found people who were very good at looking like people like that. "Where to, Miss Bennett?" her driver asked. She thought for a moment. "I need an address," she said. "Give me 20 minutes." She called James. He had it in 4. She had the driver take her past the address, once not stopping, just looking. A 3-story walk-up in a neighborhood that was clean but tired. The kind of neighborhood where the buildings were old enough to have character, but too old to have been renovated yet. The kind of neighborhood where people stretched things and made them work and didn't complain about it. She didn't see Ethan Brooks. It was mid-afternoon. He was probably, she thought about this, probably doing exactly what she would have done if she'd been fired from a job at 10 in the morning with a daughter to pick up at 3:15. He was probably sitting somewhere, working through a plan. She hoped he was. She hoped he hadn't given up. She hoped that 4 years of being invisible hadn't made him stop believing he was worth seeing. She had the driver take her to her office. She had 6 meetings that afternoon. She ran all of them from the end of the conference table, with her arm in its sling, and her executive team learned, as her teams always learned eventually, that injury did not reduce Charlotte Bennett's attention to detail by even a single degree. Between the 3rd and 4th meetings, she stepped into her private office and called the direct number for Hargrove's acting board chair, a man named Gerald Hostes, who had held a ceremonial leadership role for so long that he'd apparently forgotten it was supposed to be meaningful. "Charlotte," he said, genuinely surprised. She never called directly. "I heard about your accident. I'm so sorry, Gerald," she said pleasantly. "I want to talk to you about a purchase offer." "Are you free tomorrow morning?" A pause. "A purchase offer," he repeated. "For Hargrove. We've been watching the company for some time. I think the timing is right. Charlotte, we'd need to convene the board." "Of course. I'll have my acquisition team send a preliminary term sheet by end of business today, so the board has something concrete to review." "This is a friendly offer, Gerald. I'd like to keep it that way." She could hear him recalibrating. "What's driving the timing?" he asked. "Good fundamentals," she said, "and some recent insights into the company's operational culture that I think represent an opportunity." "Operational culture," he repeated, with the tone of a man who had never once thought about operational culture. "I'll see you tomorrow at 9, she said. "Thank you, Gerald." She ended the call, sat for a moment, and allowed herself one small thing, not quite a smile, but close. The feeling of pieces beginning to move. Then she went back into her 4th meeting. The term sheet went out at 6:45. By 7:15, Gerald Hoste had called back twice. She returned the second call and spoke to him for 3 minutes, confirming that the offer was serious, the valuation was fair, and her team was prepared to move at whatever pace the board required. She did not mention Ethan Brooks. Not yet. She got home at 8:30. Her housekeeper had left dinner in the refrigerator, and she ate it standing at the kitchen counter one-handed, reading the due diligence file on her tablet. She was not supposed to be reading anything. She was supposed to be resting. Her shoulder ached from the cast. Her head ached from everything else. She kept reading. At 9:40, she set the tablet down and did something she almost never did. She thought about her mother. Her mother had been a school librarian in a small town in western Pennsylvania. She had made $32,000 a year for 31 years, and she had known the name of every child who came into her library and what they liked to read, and who was struggling at home and needed a quiet place, and who needed an extra hour before the bus came because something at home wasn't safe. She had never been promoted. She had never been recognized. She had never been written up in a trade publications or honored at a gala. She had simply shown up every day and seen the people in front of her. Charlotte had spent 22 years trying to become the opposite of invisible, to make things so large and so visible and so undeniable that no one could ever look past her. She had succeeded at that. She wasn't sure, sitting in her kitchen at 9:40 with a broken arm and a file on a company she'd decided to buy, partly because of a man she'd met for 3 minutes in the rain, whether success and rightness were the same thing. She thought Ethan Brooks might know something about that. She thought Sophie Brooks might know something about it, too. She turned off the kitchen light. She went to bed. She was already thinking about what she was going to say when she knocked on his door. 3 days later, the Hargrove board voted to accept a preliminary acquisition offer from Charlotte's firm, Bennett Capital Partners, at a valuation 12% above current market. Gerald Hostay called it a strong outcome for shareholders. 2 of the board members called to thank her. One called to ask if she'd be making any leadership changes. Significant ones, she said. She heard the pause on the other end. Including at the operational management level? Especially there, she said. She ended the call, looked at the board on her office wall, where James had pinned a photograph of Ethan Brooks, a grainy image from the Hargrove employee directory. A man in his mid-30s with a direct expression, and the kind of face that had learned to expect nothing from the room it was standing in. She looked at it for a long moment. Then she opened her desk drawer and took out the notepad where she'd written 2 words the morning after the accident, when she'd still been in the hospital and James had first given her the name. The 2 words were, "Be careful." She had written them to herself. A reminder, because Charlotte Bennett knew her own patterns, and she knew that the thing she was building in her mind around Ethan Brooks, the narrative of the honest man, the invisible worker, the quiet hero, was a narrative that could distort her judgment if she let it. She had to be sure. She had to separate what she felt from what she knew. She knew he had saved her life. She knew he had 4 years of documented performance that his employer had systematically undervalued. She knew he had been fired 11 minutes after arriving late to a job he had almost certainly been unable to get to on time because of what he'd done for her the night before. She knew he was raising his daughter alone. She knew he had not left his name. She folded the notepad and put it back in the drawer. These were not feelings. These were facts. You could build something on facts. She picked up her phone and called James. "I want to meet him," she said. "Not yet, not until the acquisition is closed, but I want everything in place first. I'm not going to show up at that man's door with a story and no structure behind it." "Understood," James said. "Timeline, 30 days, she said. "Maybe less." She set the phone down and looked out the window at the city, doing what cities do, moving, grinding, producing, consuming, everything constantly in motion and very little of it, meaning anything to anyone in particular. She thought about a man running through rain towards a fire. She thought about what it meant that his first instinct had been to run toward it. And she thought about what it would mean to finally put that instinct somewhere it could actually change something. 30 days, she had work to do. 31 days after the accident, on a Thursday morning in October, Ethan Brooks was sitting at his kitchen table at 6:47 a.m., working through the same spreadsheet he'd been working through every morning for the past month. The numbers had not improved their opinion of him. He had applied to 22 positions since Hargrove. Heard back from 9, interviewed with 5. 2 had offered positions, 1 a 40-minute commute each way, with a pay cut that would have made the rent math impossible, and 1 a night shift arrangement that would have required leaving Sophie alone between midnight and 6 a.m., which was not an arrangement that existed in any universe Ethan Brooks was willing to inhabit. So he was still at the kitchen table at 6:47, coffee going cold, spreadsheet open, running the numbers for what felt like the 10,000th time. Sophie came downstairs in her socks, slid the last 2 feet across the linoleum, the way she always did when she thought he wasn't watching, and pulled out the chair across from him. "You're doing the spreadsheet again," she said. "I'm reviewing our financial situation." "That's the same thing." She pulled the cereal box toward her. "Are we okay?" He looked at his daughter, 8 years old, eating cereal in her socks, asking if they were okay with the same directness she brought to every important question. He had never lied to her about the hard things. He wasn't going to start now. "We're tight," he said, "but we're okay. I have 2 more interviews this week." "Good ones? Decent ones?" She nodded and ate her cereal, and he watched her for a moment, the way she tilted the bowl slightly to catch the last of the milk. The way she'd tucked 1 foot underneath her on the chair and felt the familiar compression in his chest that was equal parts love and terror and responsibility, and the specific exhaustion of being the only person standing between an 8-year-old and a world that didn't care about her the way he did. "Dad," Sophie said without looking up. "Yeah, Mrs. Peterson said someone from a big company came to school yesterday." He stopped. "What?" Sophie looked up. Her expression was careful. "Too careful for 8, she said. "A woman came and asked about you." "About our family," she said. The woman was very nice, but that she told her she couldn't give personal information out. Ethan set his coffee down. "What woman?" he said. "What did she look like?" Sophie shrugged. But it was the shrug of someone who had more information and was deciding how much to release. Mrs. Peterson said she was well dressed, and that she had her arm in a sling. The words landed like cold water. Ethan sat very still. "When did Mrs. Peterson tell you this?" "Yesterday afternoon." "When you picked me up, I was going to tell you, but you seemed tired." Sophie looked at him steadily. "It's the lady from the highway, isn't it?" It wasn't a question. She was 8 years old, and she already knew. "Maybe," he said. "She found you, maybe." Sophie put her spoon down. "Are you mad?" He thought about it, honestly, the way he thought about things his daughter asked. Was he mad? He reached inside himself and checked. He found something, but it wasn't anger. It was something closer to exposure. The feeling of having a door opened that he'd decided to keep closed. "No," he said. "I'm not mad." "Good," Sophie said, and picked her spoon back up. "Because I think you should talk to her." Ethan looked at his daughter. "You don't know anything about her," he said. "I know she drove to my school to find out if we were okay." Sophie didn't look up from her cereal. "That's something." He had no answer for that. He picked up his coffee and found it was cold. He thought about it all morning. He dropped Sophie at school, came back, sat at the table again, tried to work on the job applications. Couldn't concentrate, got up, washed the dishes, sat back down. Opened the spreadsheet, closed it. At 9:45, his phone rang from a number he didn't recognize. Area code he didn't know. He almost let it go, then he picked it up. "Ethan Brooks," said a woman's voice. He knew the voice. He'd only heard it for about 3 minutes, lying on wet asphalt in the rain. But voices like that, voices that managed to be both composed and urgent at the same time, didn't leave the memory easily. "Yes," he said, a pause. "Brief, this is Charlotte Bennett." Another pause. "I believe you know why I'm calling." Ethan leaned back in his chair and looked at the ceiling and said, "How did you get this number?" "The same way I found out you were fired, 11 minutes after saving my life," she said. "I'm good at finding things out. You went to my daughter's school." "I went to verify some information. I did not approach Sophie. I spoke only to the office, and only to ask general questions. I'm sorry if that felt like an intrusion. I needed to understand your situation before I contacted you." "Why?" "Because I wanted to make sure that what I'm going to offer you is something I'm offering for the right reasons, and not just because I feel like I owe you something." He sat forward. "What you're going to offer me?" "Yes." "Ms. Bennett." "Charlotte," he said it carefully. "I didn't pull you out of that car because I wanted something from you." "I know that," she said, and the way she said it, quick, certain, no qualifications, stopped him. "That's exactly why I'm calling. That's exactly why I'm calling. If you'd waited for the ambulance, if you'd given your name, if you'd done any of the things people do when they want to be seen, I'd be sending you a thank you card and a gift basket, and that would be the end of it. But you didn't. You just left. And I think that tells me more about who you are than anything else I've found out." Ethan was quiet for a moment. "What have you found out?" he asked. "That you are significantly underemployed. Relative to your actual capabilities," she said. "That you have been for at least 4 years keeping a company running while a man with a clipboard took credit for it. That you are raising your daughter alone, and doing it very well under circumstances that most people would use as an excuse to do it badly. And that you were fired 11 minutes after arriving late to a job you were late to because you'd spent the previous night saving my life." He said nothing. "I want to meet with you," she said. "In person. I'm not going to offer you charity. I'm not going to offer you a reward. I want to offer you something specific, and I want to do it face to face, because I think you're the kind of person who needs to look someone in the eye before you decide whether to trust them. And if I say no, then I'll respect that," she said. "Completely. And I'll find another way to address what happened to you that doesn't require your participation." He frowned. "What does that mean?" "It means that I have resources and I have reach, and what happened to you at Hargrove is something I consider my business regardless of whether you want to meet with me. But I'd rather do this with you than around you." He put his elbow on the table and pressed his forehead into his hand, and thought about Sophie sliding across the linoleum in her socks. He thought about the spreadsheet. He thought about the job with the night shift that would have left his daughter alone. "When?" he said. "Tomorrow," she said. 10 a.m. I'll send you the address." He almost said no. The word was right there. "All right," he said instead. The address she sent was an office building downtown, one of the clean, glass-fronted ones with a lobby that made people feel small on purpose. Ethan knew the type. He'd done a parts delivery to a building like this once, 3 years back, and a security guard had redirected him to the freight entrance without making eye contact. He wore his good jacket, the one he'd bought for job interviews, dark gray, slightly too big in the shoulders now, because he'd lost weight in the 6 months after Laura died and never quite found it again. He got there at 9:53 and told the front desk his name and was immediately, with no waiting, escorted to the 23rd floor. He noticed that, the no waiting, he filed it away. The 23rd floor was quieter than he expected. Less activity, more focus. People moving with purpose rather than volume. A woman in a blue blazer met him at the elevator and brought him to a conference room. Not the big, formal one he'd expected, but a smaller one. A table with 6 chairs, a window, 2 glasses of water already set out. He stood by the window and waited. He didn't sit. He wasn't sure why. Something in him needed to be standing when she walked in. She walked in at exactly 10 o'clock. He recognized her immediately, which surprised him. He'd seen her unconscious, and in the rain. But something about the way she moved was distinct. Fast but not rushed, purposeful in a way that wasn't performance. She had a cast on her left arm, a navy blazer over it, and she was looking directly at him before she was fully through the door. She stopped a few feet away, and they looked at each other for a moment without speaking. "You look better than the last time I saw you," he said, because he didn't know what else to say. Something shifted in her expression. Not quite a smile, but adjacent to one. "You look worse than the last time I saw you," she said. "But to be fair, I was unconscious for most of that." He almost smiled. "Almost. Sit down," she said, "please." They sat across from each other at the table, and Charlotte Bennett looked at him with those gray eyes that had tried to focus on his face in the rain, and she said, without preamble, "Thank you for being here. You didn't leave me a lot of room to say no," he said. "I gave you the option. You also told me you'd handle it without me if I said no. That's not really an option. That's a choice between participating and watching." She nodded. "Fair, I'm not good at letting things go." "I got that impression." Another moment. She turned the glass of water slightly. On the table, not nervous, he thought, just thinking. "I want to be direct with you," she said, "because I think you prefer it, and because I don't have the patience for anything else." "Go ahead." "I purchased Hargrove Logistics Solutions," she said. "The acquisition closed 4 days ago." He stared at her. He stopped. "Controlling interest," she said. "Through my firm. The deal's been in process for 31 days. You started this 31 days ago." "Yes." He stopped again. "That's the day after." "Yes," she said, "it is." He sat back in his chair and looked at her with an expression that he couldn't have named himself, not anger, not gratitude, something closer to the feeling of ground shifting under your feet when you thought you were standing on something solid. "Miss Bennett." "Charlotte." He said it like a decision. "I need you to understand something. Whatever you're planning to do here, if it's because you feel like you owe me." "I told you on the phone," she said, and her voice was patient but not soft. "This is not about debt. I've done the math on debt and it doesn't work. If I owed you for saving my life, I couldn't pay that back. There isn't a number." She paused. "So I stopped thinking about it that way." "Then what way are you thinking about it?" "I'm thinking about it as an investment," she said. "In a person whose qualities I would have had to search a long time to find, and who landed in front of me because the universe has a sense of irony." She leaned forward slightly. "I've been in business for 22 years. I have worked with hundreds of people. I know the difference who performs well and someone who is exceptional. You are exceptional, not because of one night on a highway. Because of 4 years at a company that didn't deserve you, and the way you handled all of it." "I didn't handle it," he said. "I got fired." "You left with your integrity intact," she said. "In that building, in that situation, that was the harder thing to do." He was quiet. She let the quiet exist without filling it, which told him something about her. "What are you proposing?" he said finally. "I want you to lead the operational transformation of Hargrove," she said. "New title, significant compensation increase, full authority over process restructuring and team development. The existing management layer is being largely replaced. I need someone who knows that company from the inside and knows how it should run, because they've been running it informally for years." The silence that followed was long enough to be its own kind of answer. "You're serious," he said. "I don't do proposals I'm not serious about." "I was a warehouse technician." "You were a warehouse technician in the same way that a structural engineer is a construction worker," she said. "The title reflects what they paid you to do. It doesn't reflect what you actually did." He pressed his lips together and looked at the table and thought about Dale Whitfield's face when he'd set the badge down on that clipboard. The complete absence of anything in that face. The way that absence had felt like confirmation of something he'd been afraid was true, that he was exactly as small as the space they'd given him. "What happened to Dale Whitfield?" he asked. "Separated from the company effective acquisition date," she said. "Along with 3 other members of the operations management team." "Who made that decision?" "I did," she said, "based on a thorough review of personnel records, internal communications, and operational metrics. Not based on anything you told me, because you haven't told me anything." She paused. Was I wrong? He thought about the 3 flags he'd sent. The 3 written warnings, timestamped, ignored. The incident report with his name on it. "No," he said, "you weren't wrong." "I know," she said simply. He stood up and walked to the window, because he needed a moment, and standing still wasn't providing it. The city moved below him, traffic people, the ordinary machinery of a Thursday morning. He thought about Laura. He thought about the way she used to say, "When things felt impossible, Ethan, the only direction is forward." She'd said it so many times it had become a kind of shorthand between them. When the medical bills arrived, when the treatment wasn't working, when they both knew, without saying it, that time was getting short. The only direction is forward. He'd kept moving, he'd done what she said. But somewhere in the forward motion he'd stopped believing the destination meant anything. He'd started thinking of forward as just a direction. Not a place you were going, just away from where you were. He turned back from the window. "I have a daughter," he said. "My schedule has non-negotiables. School pickup is at 3:15 unless there's prior arrangement. Sick days don't give me advance notice. If she has a concert or a parent event, I'm there." "Understood," Charlotte said. "I'm not going to pretend those things don't exist to look more available than I am." "I wouldn't want you to," she said. "The culture I want to build at Hargrove is one where people are actual human beings. Starting with leadership." She paused. "Especially starting with leadership." He looked at her. "Why me?" he said. "You could find an experienced operations director. Someone with the credentials, the management history." "I could," she said. "I've hired 100 people with credentials and management history. Credentials tell me what someone has done. History tells me where they've been. Neither one tells me who they are when no one's watching." She held his gaze. "I know who you are when no one's watching." He felt something move in him, the particular motion of a wall that is held for a long time beginning, not to fall, but to consider it. "I need to think about this," he said. "Of course." "I'm not saying no." "I know," she said. He picked up his jacket from the back of the chair. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "Yes." "Why Hargrove, specifically?" "You could have acquired anything. Why that company?" She was quiet for a moment. "Because it was already yours," she said. "In every way that mattered. The operation ran because of you. The numbers worked because of you. And they took that from you in the most casual, thoughtless way imaginable. And I watched it happen on a traffic camera from a hospital bed. And I thought, no." She paused. "I thought not if I can help it." He looked at her for a long moment. "I'll call you," he said. "I'll be here," she said. He walked out, down the hall into the elevator, across the lobby, through the front door and back into the city that was still doing what cities do, utterly indifferent to the fact that something inside Ethan Brooks had just shifted on its axis. He drove home, sat in the parked car in front of the apartment building for 11 minutes without going in. Then he went inside, sat at the kitchen table, opened his laptop, and did not open the spreadsheet. He opened a blank document instead. He typed, "What do I need to be sure of before I say yes?" And he started writing. That same afternoon, 3 miles away, Charlotte Bennett was standing in the conference room that had been set up as the operational transition headquarters for the Hargrove acquisition. 17 people were in the room, Her M&A director was presenting the integration timeline. Her CFO was flagging 3 cost centers for immediate review. Her HR lead was walking through the personnel assessment process. She was listening to all of it and simultaneously thinking about the way Ethan Brooks had stood at the window. She'd interviewed a lot of people. She knew what ambition looked like, and she knew what fear looked like. And she knew what the peculiar combination of capability and suppression looked like, the expression on a person's face when they've spent so long being told they're smaller than they are that they've started to believe it. She'd seen it on his face. She'd also seen the moment when it moved. When something in him pushed back against it, she'd seen that in his eyes at the window. A man redeciding something. Charlotte, her M&A director Kevin, was looking at her. The Devlin contract, do you want to keep it or let it expire? She refocused. Keep it. Renegotiate the terms. Who handled it originally? Kevin checked his notes. A technician named Brooks flagged issues with it 3 times before the problems materialized. Charlotte said nothing. He was terminated just before acquisition, Kevin added. Do you want to flag him as a potential rehire? I'll handle that directly, she said. Kevin made a note. Nobody in the room asked a follow-up question. Because Charlotte's team had learned when follow-up questions were welcome and when they were not. She moved the meeting forward. By 6 o'clock, they had a 90-day integration plan, a personnel transition framework, and a culture audit protocol that Charlotte had written herself over 2 evenings and revised 4 times. She stayed after everyone else left, sat at the conference table alone in the quiet, and spread the personnel files across the table. Not the executives. Those were simple, but the warehouse floor employees, the mid-level operators, the people whose names never appeared in board reports. She read for 2 hours. What she found made her jaw tighten. It wasn't unique to Hargrove. She'd seen versions of it before. The systematic undervaluing of the people who actually did the work. The way competence at the operational level got absorbed by management above it with no recognition and no return. The performance reviews that said, meets expectations for people who were exceeding them daily, because exceeding them would have required promoting them, and promoting them would have cost money, and money was managed upward, not downward. She thought about what it cost, not in dollars, in people. In the quiet accumulation of days where Mussum showed up and did more than they were asked and was thanked with nothing, and kept showing up anyway. Because they had a daughter to feed and a rent to pay, and they were not the kind of person who walked away from a thing just because no one was watching. She closed the last file. She picked up her phone and called James. I need the Hargrove employee list, cross-referenced with performance metrics versus recognition outcomes, she said. Anyone whose actual contribution significantly exceeded their compensation and advancement trajectory. I want the full picture. That's going to be a long list, James said. I know, she said. Send it anyway. She hung up and sat alone in the quiet conference room and thought about what it meant to build something differently. Not just the balance sheet, not just the org chart. The actual culture, the invisible architecture of how people treated each other, how effort was recognized, how mistakes were handled, how leadership was earned instead of assigned. She'd talked about that for years, in speeches, in board meetings, in interviews where journalists asked her, what made Bennett Capital different? She was about to find out if she meant it. Her phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number, and then she remembered she'd given it to him at the end of the meeting. Written on a card, old-fashioned. The text said, I have 3 conditions. If you can meet them, I'll say yes. E. Brooks. She read it twice. She almost smiled. She typed back, tell me the conditions. His reply took 4 minutes. She waited without impatience, which was not her natural state, but which she had decided, for reasons she was still working out, was appropriate here. His text came in 3 parts. First, my daughter comes first. Always. No exceptions, no explanations required. Second, I won't put my name on decisions I don't believe in. If I tell you something is wrong, you have to be willing to hear it, even if it's inconvenient. Third, the people on that warehouse floor get treated like human beings. That's not a goal. That's a condition of my involvement. Charlotte read all three. Then she typed back. She typed yes. Yes, and yes, report Monday. She set the phone face down on the table. The room was very quiet. She sat with that quiet for a moment, the way she'd sat with quiet in the hospital room 4 weeks ago watching a traffic camera video for the 4th time, trying to understand what she was looking at. She was still trying to understand it. Maybe that was okay. Maybe some things you understood better by moving toward them than by standing still and analyzing them from a distance. She picked up the last personnel file. She started reading again. 2 floors below, in the building's lobby, a security guard named Raymond, who'd worked the desk for 11 years, was ending his shift and telling his replacement about the woman on the 23rd floor who'd stayed past 7 p.m. for the 3rd day in a row. "What's she doing up there?" the replacement asked. Raymond shrugged. "Reading files," he said. "Personnel files." "Employee records," he paused. "She's got this look, you know. Like she's fixing something. Like she found something that's wrong. And she's not going to leave until it's right." The replacement considered this. "Good boss or bad boss?" he asked. Raymond thought about it for a moment. "Good," he said. "I think. The kind that actually means it." He picked up his jacket and headed for the door. 4 days later, Ethan Brooks drove to the Hargrove building for the first time since the morning he'd set his badge on Dale Whitfield's clipboard. He sat in the parking lot for a moment. The building looked the same. Of course it did. Buildings didn't change because the people inside them changed. He got out of the car. He walked in, through the front door, not the freight entrance, not the side door, the front door. The receptionist looked up. "Ethan Brooks," he said. "I'm meeting with the transition team." She checked her screen and nodded immediately. "Of course, Mr. Brooks, you can go right up." He took the elevator to the 3rd floor, the management floor, a floor he had been on exactly twice in 4 years, both times to deliver paperwork he hadn't been invited to discuss. Charlotte Bennett was already in the conference room with her team. She looked up when he walked in, and something in her expression shifted, not dramatically, not in a way the room could easily read, but he caught it. "Mr. Brooks," she said, "thank you for coming." He looked around the room. 12 people, serious faces, the assembled machinery of acquisition and transition. He set his jacket over the back of a chair. "Where do we start?" he said. And the room collectively exhaled. Because something about the way he said it, not tentatively, not performing confidence. Just the direct practicality of a person who has accepted a thing and is already moving communicated something that 12 experienced professionals recognized without being able to name. This was going to be different. The meeting ran 4 hours. Ethan spoke less than anyone else in the room. He asked questions that stopped conversations cold. He identified 3 process failures in the integration plan that Kevin, who'd been doing M&A work for 17 years, had not caught. He did it without fanfare. Just, "Here's the problem. Here's why. Here's one possible solution. What do you think?" At one point, Charlotte looked at him across the table, and he caught her looking. She didn't look away, neither did he. He left at 6:15 to pick up Sophie. He was at the school at 3:17, 2 minutes late, which he acknowledged to Sophie with the gravity it deserved. 2 minutes, she said, getting into the car. "Traffic," he said. She accepted this with a nod. Then, how was it? He thought about the conference room. About Charlotte Bennett's gray eyes across the table. About the feeling of finally being in a room where the questions he asked didn't make people uncomfortable. "Good," he said. Sophie looked at him, like actually good, she said. Or just okay good. He pulled out of the school parking lot and thought about it. Honestly, the way he always did. Actually good, he said. Sophie nodded once, decisive. Okay, she said, and then she reached into her backpack and pulled out her homework folder and opened it in her lap, 'cause she was 8 years old and efficient, and she had 17 minutes before they got home, and she wasn't going to waste them. Ethan watched her out of the corner of his eye. He thought about Laura. He thought about the only direction is forward. He thought about what it felt like when forward finally started to look like something. He drove home in the early October dark, and for the first time, in a very long time, the numbers in his head weren't the rent and the field trip and the water heater. They were the 3 process failures he'd found in the integration plan. And the 6 others he hadn't mentioned yet, because he was saving those for Monday. Monday arrived the way Mondays always arrive, without asking whether anyone was ready. Ethan was up at 5:15, not because he'd set an alarm for 5:15, but because his body had apparently decided that sleep was a luxury that belonged to a version of his life that no longer applied. He lay on his back in the dark for exactly 4 minutes, running through what he knew about the day ahead. Then he got up. He made coffee. He checked his phone. He looked at the 6 process failures he'd written down on Saturday morning while Sophie was at her friend Maya's birthday party, sitting in the car in the parking lot of a Chuck E. Cheese because he'd been too wired to go inside and watch animatronic animals perform, and he'd had a yellow legal pad in the back seat, and the problems had been right there at the front of his mind wanting to get out. He read through what he'd written. The 6 problems were real. He'd lived them. He knew where they lived in the building, what time of day they showed up, what they looked like in the numbers before they became disasters. He also knew, reading his own notes with fresh eyes, that solving them wasn't just about process. It was about people. Specifically, it was about whether the people on that warehouse floor were going to trust a man who used to stand alongside them and was now showing up in a different jacket with a different title, and whether that trust could be earned back, or whether he'd already spent it by taking the job. That was the thing that kept him awake, not the job. Not Charlotte Bennett or the board meeting or the 6 problems on the yellow legal pad. The thing that kept him awake was Marcus. Marcus Webb had been Ethan's closest thing to a friend at Hargrove. 47, father of 3, 12 years on the floor, the kind of man who knew where every single item in the warehouse lived and could locate it in the dark if he had to. Marcus had texted him 3 times since the termination. The first said, "That was garbage what they did." The second said, "You find something yet?" The third, sent 2 days ago, when word had apparently gotten around that the acquisition had happened and changes were coming, said, "Ethan, what's going on? People are scared." Ethan had not responded to any of them. Not because he didn't want to, because he didn't know yet what he was allowed to say, and he wasn't going to say something he couldn't stand behind. He finished his coffee, woke Sophie, made her lunch, drove her to school, came back, changed into the clothes he'd laid out the night before, not the good jacket, which felt like performance, but a clean button-down and dark slacks. Because he wanted to look like someone who took the work seriously without looking like someone who'd forgotten where the work happened. He left the apartment at 7:40. He arrived at the Hargrove building at 8:03. He used the front entrance. He took the elevator to the 3rd floor. And he walked into what Charlotte Bennett's team had converted, in the space of 4 days, from Dale Whitfield's carpeted executive suite into a working transition office, with a whiteboard that covered most of one wall. 4 laptops running simultaneously, and the particular focused energy of people who were being paid to fix something broken and had been given the tools to actually do it. Charlotte was already there. She was standing at the whiteboard, with a coffee in her good hand, and a marker in the fingers of her cast hand, and she was in the middle of a sentence when he walked in. She glanced at him, finished the sentence, and said, without breaking stride, "Ethan. Good, we need your eyes on something before 9. He liked that. He liked that she didn't stop the room for him. He liked that he was expected to catch up on the move. He set his bag down and looked at the whiteboard. "Talk me through it," he said. The problem Kevin walked him through was the Devlin contract, the same one Ethan had flagged 3 times in writing 2 years ago. Under the new acquisition, the contract had been retained and was currently active, which meant the same structural flaw. Ethan had identified a delivery schedule that was physically impossible, given the warehouse's actual throughput capacity was still sitting there, ticking. "How long until the next delivery window?" Ethan asked. Kevin checked his laptop. 18 days. "Then we have 16, Ethan said. 2 days to spare, and not a minute more." He pulled out his legal pad and flipped to the page about the Devlin problem. "I have 3 possible restructures. The cleanest one requires a conversation with the Devlin operations lead directly, not through account management. Can we arrange that?" Kevin looked at Charlotte. Charlotte looked at Ethan. "You know them?" she asked. "I know their floor supervisor," he said. "We worked through a problem 2 years ago, informally. He's reasonable. Call him today," she said. "I'll need a title," Ethan said. "Something real. I'm not calling a client contact as a transitional whatever." Charlotte didn't hesitate. She looked at her HR lead. "Send the formal appointment letter today. Director of Operations. Effective Monday." Her HR lead typed something immediately. Ethan looked at the whiteboard. "What else?" he said. By 9 o'clock, they had moved through 4 of his 6 problems and identified 2 more that hadn't been on his list but showed up when you put the right information in the same room at the same time. By 9:30, Ethan had spoken to more people with more authority in one morning than he had in 4 years at this company. He was careful not to let that feeling get ahead of him. At 9:45, Charlotte stood up and said, "Board meeting at 11. Full executive session. Ethan, I need you there." He looked at her. "You need me at the board meeting?" "Yes. In what capacity?" "As Director of Operations," she said, presenting the operational assessment. He thought about this for a moment. He thought about the board, the same board that had signed off on Dale Whitfield's management decisions for 15 years. The same board that had presumably reviewed the Devlin contract without ever flagging a concern. The same board that had watched Hargrove's operational layer get hollowed out while the numbers looked clean enough on the surface. He thought about what it would mean to stand up in front of that board. He thought about the yellow legal pad. "All right," he said. He spent the next hour with Kevin's team, pulling the data he needed and organizing it the way he thought about things, not by category, but by causality. Not what the problems were, but how they connected, why one had made the others worse, what the actual shape of the dysfunction looked like when you drew it honestly. At 10:58, he walked into the Hargrove boardroom for the first time in his life. The room had 12 chairs around the table. 10 were occupied. 9 men, 1 woman, all of them in the 60 to 70 range, all of them wearing the particular expression people who were accustomed to information being presented to them in a way that required very little of them in return. Gerald Hoste sat at the far end. He was heavyset, silver-haired, with the expansive comfort of someone who had occupied rooms like this for decades and had long since stopped questioning whether he deserved to. Charlotte took her seat at the right side of the table, not at the head. Ethan noticed that. She sat at the side on purpose. The head of the table stayed empty. "Good morning," Gerald said, with the practiced warmth of a man who'd opened 1,000 meetings this way. "Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge Charlotte's recovery." He gestured toward her cast. "We're glad you're with us." "Thank you, Gerald," she said. "I'd like to get started. We have a lot to cover. Gerald nodded. Of course. First on the agenda, the integration update. Kevin? Kevin stood. He was halfway through his first slide when Charlotte said, quietly but clearly, I'd like to change the order. Gerald looked at her. Change it to what? I'd like Ethan Brooks to present first, she said. Operational assessment, then Kevin, a shift in the room. Small but real. Two of the board members looked at each other. Gerald looked at Ethan, and Mr. Brooks is Director of Operations, Charlotte said. Appointment effective today. Another shift, longer this time. Gerald said. I see in the tone of someone who did not entirely see, but had decided not to say so in front of everyone. Ethan stood up. He did not have a presentation deck. He had his legal pad, and the whiteboard markers he'd borrowed from the transition office, and the absolute clarity that came from knowing a thing, all the way down to its bones. He walked to the whiteboard at the side of the room and started writing. He wrote the 6 problems, numbered simply, and connected them with lines that showed causality. He wrote without explaining what he was doing, just doing it, because the board could see it developing in real time, and that was better than being handed a finished picture. When he turned back to the room, Gerald Hoste was sitting slightly forward. The Devlin contract alone, Ethan said, has cost this company $340,000 in penalty fees over the past 22 months. I know because I was the one who processed the paperwork each time. I flagged the structural problem 3 times in writing. Those flags were not escalated. He paused. We have 16 days to fix it before the next window. I have a solution ready. I'd like authorization to engage Devlin's operations team directly. Silence. One of the board members, a man named Douglas, who Ethan would later learn, had been on the board for 22 years, said, You said you flagged this 3 times. In writing, yes, and it wasn't addressed. It was received, Ethan said carefully. It wasn't addressed. By whom? The operational management team, Ethan said. He wasn't going to say Dale Whitfield's name in this room. Not because he wanted to protect him, but because naming one person made it personal, and this wasn't personal. This was structural. Douglas looked at Gerald. Gerald's face had gone through several expressions in the past 60 seconds and was currently resting on something between discomfort and calculation. What are the other 5 problems? Douglas said. Ethan turned back to the whiteboard. He spent 40 minutes at that whiteboard. He did not speak carefully or diplomatically, or with the softening language of someone managing a room. He spoke the way he'd spoken to the Devlin contact 2 years ago, when they'd worked out a solution at 10 p.m. on a Tuesday, because nobody else was going to plainly, technically, without ego, with complete focus on what was true and what needed doing. By the end of it, 3 of the board members had their own notepads out. Gerald Hoste had not moved. When Ethan finished, the room was quiet for a moment that felt longer than it was. Then Douglas said, How long have you been with Hargrove? 4 years, Ethan said, until last month when I was terminated. The room changed again, more sharply this time. Terminated, Douglas said. For what reason? Attendance, Ethan said. I was 11 minutes late on a day when there was an executive audit. 11 minutes, Douglas repeated. Yes, after 4 years. Yes. Douglas looked at Gerald with an expression that was not diplomatic. Gerald said, The termination decision was made at the operational management level. It wasn't brought to the board. A lot of things weren't brought to the board, Charlotte said from her seat, quietly, and the room felt it. Gerald turned to look at her. Something passed between them, not hostile, but direct. The look of a man who had just understood that the acquisition he'd thought was about real estate and logistics was also about something else, and the something else was now sitting in his boardroom, presenting on a whiteboard. What are you proposing? Gerald asked, and he was asking Charlotte, not Ethan. I'm not proposing anything, Charlotte said. Ethan presented the operational assessment. The question is what the board wants to do with it. We want to fix it, Douglas said before Gerald could speak. He said it like a man who'd been waiting to say something like it for longer than this meeting. 3 other board members agreed immediately. Gerald was silent for a moment. Then he said, "Mr. Brooks, what do you need?" Ethan looked at Gerald Hosty, who had sat in this room for 22 years, while the building 3 floors below him ran on the labor of people whose names he'd never learned. He thought about what he needed. Authority, he said. Real authority, not the kind where I solve the problems and someone else signs the decisions. If I'm director of operations, that means I make operational decisions. I bring the significant ones to Charlotte. I don't bring them to a committee. Gerald looked at Charlotte. Charlotte said nothing. Agreed, Gerald said. Ethan nodded once. 16 days on Devlin, he said. I'll have it resolved in 10. He picked up his legal pad and sat down. Kevin presented afterward, and the board meeting ran another hour, but the texture of it had changed. The board was asking different questions, sharper questions. Questions about things that actually happened in the building, rather than how the building looked from above. Ethan answered 4 of them directly, without being asked. Nobody seemed bothered by that. When the meeting ended, Douglas caught Ethan at the door. "Brooks," he said. He was tall, dry-handed, with a directness that reminded Ethan of men who'd worked their way up before they'd ever sat on a board. "That 340 in Devlin penalties. Is that in the formal record?" "It's in the incident documentation," Ethan said. "Filed under operational losses, buried in the Q3 summary as a line item." "Buried deliberately? I don't know," Ethan said. "I know it wasn't surfaced." Douglas looked at him for a moment. "I've been on this board for 22 years, he said. "I know," Ethan said. Douglas stopped. "How do you know that?" "I read the board composition report on Saturday," Ethan said. "I wanted to know who was in the room before I walked into it." Douglas looked at him with an expression that was genuinely amused. "You prepared for a board meeting you weren't told about until this morning." "I prepared for the board meeting the moment I accepted the job," Ethan said. "I just didn't know the date yet." Douglas made a sound that might have been a laugh, compressed into something more professional. "Keep fixing things," he said, and walked out. Charlotte found Ethan in the hallway 3 minutes later. The transition team was moving around them and carrying documents and laptops, the organized chaos of a company being rebuilt from its bones outward. She stopped in front of him. "How do you feel?" she asked. "I feel like I have 15 days to solve a contract problem and 6 months of work to do," he said. "That's not what I asked." He looked at her. Something in her expression was careful, the same carefulness he'd seen in Sophie's face when she was asking a real question. "I feel like I'm in the right place," he said. "For the first time in a long time." She nodded, not triumphantly, not like someone who'd been proven right. Like someone who was relieved. "Good," she said, "because I need you to do something this afternoon that's going to be harder than the board meeting." He waited. "The warehouse floor," she said. "The team that worked with you. They know you're back. Some of them think you're management now, in the way that Dale was management. I need you to go down there and talk to them." He'd known this was coming. He'd been thinking about it since 5:15. "Marcus," he said. "He's been there 12 years, she said. "He's the one they'll follow. If he's with you, you have the floor. If he's not—" "I know," Ethan said. "I can go with you," she offered. "No," he said immediately. "She not okay." He went alone. He took the stairs down to the warehouse floor because taking the elevator felt like something he didn't want to do right now. He pushed through the door, and the smell hit him immediately, the familiar combination of forklift exhaust and cardboard, and the particular industrial cold of a building that was never quite temperature controlled. and something in his chest recognized it before his brain did. He stood there for a moment. Then he walked in. The floor was running at about 70%. The transition had disrupted some of the normal operational rhythm, and there were gaps that hadn't been filled yet. Several people saw him and looked away. 2 others stopped what they were doing entirely. Marcus was at the far end, working a receiving station with the methodical efficiency of someone who'd done it thousands of times. He looked up when Ethan got close, and his expression did something complicated, something that moved through surprise and anger and relief in quick succession without settling cleanly on any of them. He set down the scanner. "Well," he said. "Hey, Marcus," Ethan said. "Couple weeks ago, you weren't returning my texts," Marcus said. "Now you're back here in different clothes. I know. You're management now. Director of operations," Ethan said. "Yeah." Marcus looked at him for a long moment. The sounds of the warehouse went on around them. Somewhere, a forklift beeped, backing up. Someone called across the floor about a pallet number. "When you didn't text back," Marcus said, "I figured either you didn't want to talk, or you were in the middle of something you couldn't talk about yet." "The second one," Ethan said. "Okay," Marcus folded his arms. "So, talk now." Ethan talked. He told Marcus everything, not the confidential details of the acquisition, the things that were Charlotte's to share, but everything he could say. How he'd been contacted, what he'd agreed to, the 3 conditions he'd given Charlotte, and what she'd said back. What the operational plan looked like, what his job actually was and wasn't. He told Marcus about the whiteboard in the boardroom this morning, and Douglas asking what he needed, and Ethan saying authority, real authority. He told him about the warehouse floor being a condition of his involvement, not a goal. When he stopped talking, Marcus was looking at him steadily. "You really said that," Marcus said, to the board. "Yes, that the people down here get treated like human beings." Yes, Marcus was quiet. Behind him, 2 other warehouse employees had drifted closer, not pretending to work, just standing, listening. He didn't tell them to move, neither did Ethan. "We had a guy leave last week," Marcus said. "Been here 9 years. Left because he got a night shift offer somewhere else for $2 less per hour." "Why?" Ethan said. "Because here he never knew what was coming next. Didn't know if he'd have hours, didn't know if his shift was changing. Didn't trust the information he was being given, because the information he'd been given was wrong too many times." Marcus paused. He'd rather take a pay cut than keep not knowing. Ethan felt the weight of that settle. "That changes," he said. "Starting now, schedules post 30 days out, minimum. Changes require 48 hours notice except genuine emergencies. Communication goes directly. I'm not going to play telephone through a management layer that's only there to absorb blame." Marcus looked at the 2 other employees who drifted over. They were both looking at Ethan. "You going to remember where you came from?" Marcus said. "A year from now, when it's comfortable up there." It was the realest question anyone had asked him today. More real than anything in the boardroom. "I don't know," Ethan said. "I think so, but I can't promise you something I can't guarantee. What I can tell you is that if I start to forget, I want you to say so. Directly, to my face." Marcus looked at him. "That's a dangerous thing to offer a man who doesn't have a filter," he said. "I know," Ethan said. "That's why I'm offering it to you." Something shifted in Marcus's face. The tension in his shoulders, the particular tension of a man who'd been bracing for disappointment, eased by a degree. "Devlin's a mess," Marcus said. "We all know it. What are you doing about it?" "Calling their operations lead today," Ethan said. "I have a restructure proposal. I need someone from this floor to verify the throughput numbers are realistic before I present them." Marcus's eyebrows went up. "You want a warehouse technician to verify numbers before you take them to a client?" I want the person who actually knows the throughput capacity of this floor to verify numbers before I take them to a client, Ethan said. That person is you. Marcus stared at him. Then he uncrossed his arms. When do you need it? He said. This afternoon, Ethan said. If you can. I can, Marcus said, like the decision had already been made, and the only question had been whether Ethan would ask correctly. Ethan called the Devlin operations contact at 2 p.m. His name was Ray Ochoa, and he answered on the second ring with the wariness of a man who'd been through too many account management calls that promised solutions and delivered apologies. Mr. Ochoa, Ethan said, this is Ethan Brooks, Director of Operations at Hargrove. We talked 2 years ago about the Q3 throughput issue. You might not remember. I remember, Ray said immediately. You actually fixed it, temporarily, before whoever was above you undid it. Yeah, Ethan said. That won't happen this time. A pause. What's changed? Ray asked. The ownership, Ethan said. And the management structure. I have a restructure proposal for the delivery schedule. I want to walk you through it, get your feedback back, and come back with a version that actually works for both sides. Another pause. You're not going to send me a PDF and ask me to sign something? No, Ethan said. You want actual feedback. I need it, Ethan said. I want the schedule to work, not to look like it works on paper. Actually work. Ray Ochoa was quiet for a moment. Okay, he said. Talk to me. The call ran an hour and 15 minutes. By the end, they had a framework that Ray called the most sensible thing he'd heard from Hargrove in 3 years. And Ethan had 4 specific modifications to his original proposal that were better than what he'd come in with, because Ray knew things about Devlin's operational rhythm that Ethan hadn't known. He walked back to the transition office and wrote up the modified proposal in 40 minutes. He sent it to Charlotte. She called him 2 minutes later. This is good, she said. Marcus verified the throughput numbers, he said. They're accurate. A brief pause. You went to Marcus first, she said. Yes. Before the call with Devlin, yes. She was quiet for a moment in a way that meant she was thinking about something. I want to debrief with you at the end of the day, she said. 6 o'clock. I have to pick Sophie up at 3:15, he said. I can be back by 4:30. 6 is fine, she said. At 3:14, he was in the school parking lot. Sophie got in the car, hiked her backpack into the back seat, and looked at him with the precise assessment of a child who had been watching her father's face for changes in the way some children watched weather. You look different, she said. Different how? She thought about it with her characteristic deliberateness. Less, she searched for the word, less like you're holding something. He looked at his daughter. Yeah, he said. Yeah, I think that's right. She nodded, satisfied, and pulled out her homework folder. He sat for a moment before starting the car, thinking about the boardroom and the whiteboard, and Marcus uncrossing his arms, and Ray Ochoa saying the most sensible thing he'd heard from Hargrove in 3 years. He thought about the water heater that was still making that sound. He thought about rent, which was still due in 4 days, which was now a different kind of problem, because he had a salary and a title and an authority that was real instead of implied. He thought about Laura. He thought, the only direction is forward. He started the car. At 6 o'clock, he sat across from Charlotte Bennett in the smaller conference room on the 23rd floor, and they debriefed the day, not just the Devlin call, but all of it. The board meeting, the whiteboard, Douglas, Marcus. She listened the way she did everything completely, without filling the space, without rushing to the next thing. When he finished, she said, You verified the numbers with Marcus before the client call. Yes. Why? Because he knows the floor better than anyone, Ethan said. And because I needed him to see that I was going to use what he knows. That his knowledge has value here. Charlotte looked at him steadily. That's not operational management, she said. That's leadership. He felt uncomfortable with the word which she apparently saw. "Don't do that," she said. "Do what? Minimize it." Her voice was patient but firm. "You did something instinctively today that most people with the titles spend years learning. Don't minimize it, because someone's saying it out loud." He said nothing for a moment. "Laura used to say that," he said. "The minimizing thing. She used to call me out on it." He hadn't meant to say that, it just came. Charlotte didn't make it strange. She didn't fill the space with sympathy or pivot away from it. She just acknowledged it, the way she acknowledged real things. "She sounds like she knew you well," she said. "Better than I know myself sometimes," he said. Still, a moment of quiet between them that was not uncomfortable. The kind of quiet that happens between people who have stopped performing for each other. "I need to ask you something," Charlotte said. "Go ahead." "Are you okay?" she said. "Not professionally, actually okay." He thought about the question honestly. "I'm getting there," he said. She nodded. "Good," she said, "because I meant what I said about investing in a person." "That includes," she paused, choosing words carefully. "That includes the whole person." He looked at her. "Thank you," he said, and meant it in a way that was different from the way he'd said "thank you" to anyone in a long time. She closed her folder. "Go home," she said. "Your daughter needs dinner." He picked up his jacket. At the door he stopped. "Charlotte," he said. She looked up. "Devlin will be resolved in 9 days," he said. "Not 10, not 16, she almost smiled. "I know," she said. He walked out into the hallway, and for the first time in a very long time, the walk to the elevator felt like a beginning, instead of an end. He solved the Devlin problem in 8 days, not 9. Not 10, 8. Ray Ochoa called him on a Wednesday morning, 7 weeks after the acquisition closed, and said, without preamble, without the careful corporate language that account calls usually required, "This is the first time in 3 years I've looked at a Hargrove schedule and believed it." He paused. "I mean that literally. I showed it to my logistics team, and they thought I'd found a different vendor." Ethan was standing in the transition office with Marcus's throughput verification sheet in one hand and his coffee in the other. "The numbers are real," he said. "We built them from the floor up." "I know," Ray said. "That's why I believe them." Another pause. "Whatever you did over there, keep doing it." Ethan set the coffee down. "We intend to." He hung up and stood for a moment with the phone in his hand. 8 days. He thought about the 3 written warnings he'd sent 2 years ago that nobody had read. He thought about the incident report with his name in the responsible party field. He thought about what it felt like to solve the same problem correctly, with authority behind him instead of in front of him blocking the way. He thought it felt like breathing. He walked down to the warehouse floor and found Marcus at the receiving station. "Devlin's done," he said. Marcus looked up. Something moved across his face, not surprise, but satisfaction. The deep, quiet satisfaction of someone who'd been waiting a long time to hear something confirmed. "How'd Ray take it?" Marcus asked. He said it was the first time in 3 years he believed a Hargrove schedule. Marcus was quiet for a moment. Then he said, 3 years. "Yeah, we've been sending bad schedules for 3 years. The schedules were accurate," Ethan said. "The problem was, they were built from the top down. Someone decided what the throughput should be, and worked backward." Nobody asked the floor. Marcus looked at him. "You asked the floor," he said. "I know the floor," Ethan said. Marcus nodded once. Then he picked up his scanner and went back to work, which was how Marcus expressed approval, and Ethan had known him long enough to understand that. The next 6 weeks moved at a pace that felt, to everyone around Ethan, like controlled acceleration. Like a machine that had been running at 40% for years, suddenly discovering what happened when you cleared the blockage and let it actually run. 3 of the 6 problems from his legal pad were resolved by the end of week 3. The other 3 required structural changes, personnel adjustments, process reasons, conversations with people who had been doing things the same wrong way for so long they'd stopped seeing it as wrong. Those conversations were harder. Some of them were uncomfortable. One of them, with a mid-level supervisor named Terry, who'd been using his position to manage by fear for 8 years, ended with a separation agreement and a room that was visibly lighter afterward. Ethan called Marcus into his office the morning after the Terry situation. "People are going to want to know what happened," Ethan said. "People already know what happened," Marcus said. "Terry was Terry. Nobody's crying. I want to be clear about the process," Ethan said. "Nobody on that floor should feel like things happen to them, without explanation. When there are changes, I'll communicate directly. No filtering." Marcus looked at him. "You're going to have to get used to people being surprised by that." "I know. They're not used to it. I know that too," Ethan said. "That's why I'm doing it every time, not just once." He started holding monthly floor meetings, not the kind where management stands at the front of the room and talks while people stand with their arms crossed, wondering when it'll be over. The kind where he asked questions and actually waited for the answers. Where the agenda was built from what the floor submitted, not what the office assumed. The first meeting had 11 attendees. The second had 23. The third was standing room. Charlotte attended the fourth one. She stood in the back and didn't say anything, just listened, and afterward she found Ethan in the hallway. "That's not a meeting," she said. "That's a culture." "It's a start," he said. "No." She looked at him with those gray eyes that had learned to focus on his face in the rain and had apparently decided to keep doing it. "It's a culture. Don't undersell what you're building." He thought about telling her. She sounded like Sophie. He decided against it. "How's the Bennett Capital Board reacting to the metrics?" he said instead. "The Q2 projection is up 11%, she said. "Douglas called me last week," he said, "and I'm quoting directly. Whatever you did, keep doing it." Ethan almost smiled. "Ray Ochoa said the same thing," he said. "Ray Ochoa and Douglas would agree on very little," she said, "which means you're doing something universally right." He went home that evening and made dinner a real dinner. Not the frozen stuff he'd been living on for the first months of single parenthood. Sophie sat at the table and watched him cook, with the focused attention she gave to things she was studying. "You're happy," she said, as a statement of observed fact. He turned from the stove. "What makes you say that?" "You're cooking," she said. "You only really cook when you're not worried." He thought about that. About how well she watched him. About the specific, precise intelligence of a child who has learned to read the room because the room contains the one person her whole world depends on. "I'm not worried," he said carefully. "I'm worried about different things now." "Better things? Things that are mine to fix," he said. "There's a difference between worrying about something you can't change and worrying about something you're actively working on." Sophie considered this with the gravity she brought to important distinctions. "That makes sense," she said. And then, "Can I come see where you work sometime?" He looked at his daughter. "Yeah," he said. "Yeah, I think you should." He brought her on a Saturday, 2 weeks later. Charlotte had offered to come in, had actually offered to arrange a whole thing, and he'd said no, that he wanted Sophie to see it as it actually was, not as a presentation. Charlotte had agreed immediately, and he'd appreciated that. He showed Sophie the warehouse floor first, because that's where the story started. Marcus was there weekend overtime, because Marcus was always there on weekends, and he stopped what he was doing when he saw them walk in. "This must be Sophie," he said. Sophie looked at him seriously. "You're Marcus. My dad talks about you." Marcus looked at Ethan with an expression that was actively trying to suppress amusement. Good things, I hope. He says you're the only person at his old job who told him the truth, Sophie said. And that you knew where everything was in the dark. Marcus looked at Ethan again. Smart kid, he said. I know, Ethan said. Sophie walked the floor with the same attentiveness she brought to museums. She asked Marcus 3 questions about the inventory system that Marcus answered completely seriously, because he recognized when a question was a real question regardless of who was asking it. She asked Ethan why certain things were organized the way they were, and he explained the logic, and she nodded like someone filing the information away for later use. She was quiet in the elevator, up to the 3rd floor. Dad, she said. Yeah, those people down there, she said. They seem different than I thought. Different how? Less invisible, she said. He looked at his daughter. She looked up at him. That's what you're doing right, she said. Making them less invisible. He thought about Marcus uncrossing his arms. He thought about the standing room floor meeting. He thought about the supervisor named Terry, who used to managed by E and didn't anymore. Trying to, he said. Sophie nodded. Mom would have liked that, she said simply, and looked back at the elevator doors. He kept his eyes forward and breathed through the moment the way he'd learned to breathe through the moments that came without warning. Yeah, he said. She would have. The 3rd floor transition office had been converted by now into something that looked like an actual working headquarters, no longer the urgent chaos of acquisition, but the organized momentum of an operation finding its rhythm. 2 of Charlotte's transition team members were still there on rotation. The rest had been replaced by people Ethan had hired or promoted from within, people whose names he too knew before he gave them new titles. Sophie walked through the office taking everything in. She stopped at the whiteboard, the big one, the one that had been cleaned and redrawn a dozen times now, but still bore the ghost impressions of Ethan's original 6 problems in dry erase marker that hadn't fully wiped away. What's that? She asked, pointing to the ghost marks. That's where it started, he said. She looked at it for a moment. Can I write something on it? She said. He thought about it. He handed her a marker. She uncapped it, thought for a moment, then wrote in the careful, deliberate printing of a child who takes letters seriously. She wrote, "Do the right thing when no one is watching." Then she capped the marker and handed it back. He stood, looking at what she'd written on the board, in his office, in the building that had fired him, 11 minutes after the night that had changed everything, and felt something move through him that he didn't have a word for. Something complete. Sophie, he said. Yeah, how'd you know to write that? She shrugged with one shoulder. That's the rule, right? You told me. On the way home that night. That's why you didn't give her your name. He looked at his daughter, who was 8 years old, and already understood something it took most people a lifetime to learn, and who had learned it from watching her father. Yeah, he said. That's the rule. He took a photo of the whiteboard. He didn't post it anywhere or show anyone. He just had it. Charlotte saw it 3 weeks later, the writing still on the board, and she stood in front of it for a moment without saying anything. Then she looked at him. Sophie, she said. Sophie, he said. She nodded and went back to work. It was the kind of moment that didn't need more than it was. The first quarterly review under new ownership was held on a Tuesday in December, 4 months after Ethan had walked into the boardroom and stood at the whiteboard with a legal pad and the accumulated knowledge of 4 years of being ignored. The numbers were better than projected, not dramatically, not the kind of numbers that made headlines, but steadily, structurally better. The kind of better that came from problems being identified before they became disasters, from schedules that were built from reality instead of wishful thinking, from people who understood what was expected of them and why. Douglas opened the meeting by looking at the operational report for a long time without speaking. Then he said, "I've been on this board for 22 years. This is the first time I've read an operational report and felt like I understood what was actually happening in the building. He said it to the room. But he was looking at Ethan. Ethan said, "The report should always tell you what's actually happening. If it doesn't, it's not a report, it's a performance." Gerald Hoste, who had been quieter in each successive meeting, said, "Some of us built our careers on those performances." The room went still. It was the most honest thing Gerald had said since the acquisition. Ethan looked at him, this man who had sat in comfortable rooms for 22 years, while the building beneath him ran on invisible labor, and he didn't feel anger. He felt something closer to recognition, the recognition of a man who had just said a true thing, probably for the first time in a long time, and was surprised by how it felt. "Gerald," Ethan said, "the people downstairs have been carrying this company for years. The fact that they're finally being seen doesn't mean the work wasn't always happening. It was. You just didn't know who was doing it." Gerald was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I know who's doing it now." It wasn't an apology. But it wasn't nothing. Charlotte said nothing during this exchange. She let it exist. When the meeting moved on, she moved with it, and afterward. When the room had cleared and it was just the two of them at the conference table with the afternoon light going thin through the window, she said, "That was important." "Gerald talking?" Ethan said. "Gerald admitting," she said. "There's a difference." He thought about that. "You think it's real?" "I think he's a man who's been in a comfortable room for a long time, and has just realized the comfort was borrowed," she said. "Whether he does anything with that, I don't know. But the realization is real." Ethan nodded. "How are the people on the floor?" she asked. "Better," he said, carefully. "Better. They've been burned before. Trust takes longer to rebuild than it took to break." Marcus is, he thought about it. Marcus is watching. He's not skeptical anymore, but he's watching. That's appropriate. He should be watching. I should be watched. Charlotte looked at him with something in her expression that was hard to name. Not admiration exactly, something more complicated than that. Something that involved knowing someone well enough to understand what they were actually saying. "I want to tell you something," she said. "Okay. When I started this," she said, "I was honest with myself that there were two reasons. The business case and you. I told myself the business case was primary. That you were a factor, but not the reason." He waited. "I was lying to myself," she said. "The business case is real. The numbers support everything. But I bought that company because of you. Because of what happened on that highway. Because I watched a man do the right thing when there was no audience and no reward, and I thought, if that's who he is when no one's watching, imagine what he can do when someone finally gives him room." He was very still. "Charlotte, I'm not saying that to make you uncomfortable," she said. "I'm saying it because I think you deserve to know the honest version of why you're here. You asked me once if this was charity. It wasn't, but it also wasn't purely business. It was recognition, the recognition of something real in a person who had been systematically unrecognized." She paused. "I think you had a right to know that." He looked at the table for a moment. Then he looked up. "My wife used to say that the worst thing that could happen to a good person was to spend their whole life in a room that was too small for them," he said. "Not because they'd stop being good, but because eventually they'd stop believing the goodness was worth anything." Charlotte said nothing. "I was getting there," he said. "To the stopping, not all the way, but I could see it. The edge of it." He paused. "So when you ask if what you did matters, yeah. It matters, not because you gave me a job, because you refused to let that edge get any closer." The room was very quiet. Outside, the city moved and ground and produced and consumed, indifferent, as ever, as cities always are. Inside, two people sat across a conference table and understood each other in the specific, rare way that happens when two people have both, in their different ways, been carrying something heavy for a long time and have just set it down in the same place. Thank you, Charlotte said finally. For what? For saying yes, she said. For the 3 conditions. For Marcus. For Sophie's writing on the whiteboard, she paused. For running toward a fire instead of away from it. He thought about the rain. He thought about the door that wouldn't move. He thought about the smell of fuel and the sound of fire and a woman's hand grabbing his wrist with a grip that was stronger than it had any right to be. He thought about driving home in the dark with his sleeping daughter and the radio off, and the window cracked 2 inches, and the cut on his palm, and the feeling of having done the only possible thing. And therefore, not the feeling of heroism, but just rightness. The quiet rightness of a decision that required no deliberation, because it was already decided by who you were. I didn't run toward it, he said. I just didn't run away from it. There's a difference. Charlotte considered this. Maybe, she said. But in my experience, not running away is most of what courage actually is. 6 months after the acquisition closed, the Hargrove warehouse floor was running at 93% efficiency, the highest in the company's recorded history. Employee turnover had dropped by 61%. 3 people who had submitted resignations before the acquisition withdrew them. Marcus got a title change, Senior Operations Coordinator, that came with a raise that reflected what he'd been contributing for 12 years. He didn't make a big deal of it. He came into Ethan's office, read the appointment letter, looked up, and said, "You spelled my last name wrong." Ethan looked at the letter. He hadn't. "No, I didn't," he said. Marcus looked again. "Huh," he said, "okay." He folded the letter and put it in his chest pocket. "Thanks, man. That was it. That was all it needed to be." Charlotte came to the 6-month marker review with a single printed page, not a presentation deck, not a financial summary, just 1 page, and set it on the conference table in front of Ethan. It was the Bennett Capital internal criteria sheet for what she called a Category 1 investment. The highest category. The one reserved for companies that had demonstrated not just financial returns, but structural integrity. Companies that had proven their value was not a number but a system, a culture, a way of operating that would survive individual personnel changes because it was built into the bones of the organization. Hargrove Logistics Solutions was the only company in the history of Bennett Capital to achieve Category 1 classification inside 12 months of acquisition. Ethan looked at the page. He thought about Dale Whitfield's face when he'd set the badge on the clipboard. The complete absence of anything in that face. He thought about the spreadsheet on the kitchen table. The job with the night shift. The water heater making that sound. He thought about Sophie writing on the whiteboard, in her careful, deliberate printing. He thought about Laura, who had said the only direction is forward, so many times. It had become a kind of faith, the way things become faith. When you say them often enough and true enough, and they prove themselves enough times over. He set the page down. "Charlotte," he said. She looked at him. "I need you to know something," he said. She waited. "I almost didn't stop," he said, "that night on the highway. I almost drove past. I saw the accident, and for about 1 second, I thought Sophie's in the car. It's late. Someone else will stop. Someone else is already calling." He paused. 1 second. Charlotte was very still, and then she said, "And then I stopped," he said, "because 1 second is all it takes to decide who you are." She looked at him across the table. This woman who had built 22 years of success on the twin pillars of intelligence and will, who had learned to protect herself with competence, the way others protect themselves with walls, who had cried silently in a hospital bed, watching a traffic camera video because it showed her something she'd been afraid to believe still existed in the world, and she nodded. She nodded the way you nod when someone tells you the thing you already knew but needed to hear said aloud. "Yes," she said, "that's exactly what it takes." 2 weeks later, Sophie's school had its annual talent show. Ethan sat in the 3rd row because he'd arrived 12 minutes early, which was not the behavior of a man still worried about the spreadsheet. Marcus came because Ethan had mentioned it once, and Marcus had showed up, which was also Marcus's way of expressing loyalty. Charlotte came because Ethan had, in a moment of impulse, he still wasn't entirely sure about, mentioned the date, and she had simply said, "What time?" She sat next to Marcus. Marcus, who was 6'1" and had worked warehouse floors for 12 years, and had the particular wariness of a man who'd been through enough to earn it, glanced at her sideways once and then said, "You're the one who bought the company." "I am," she said. He looked forward. "Thank you," he said, "for doing it the way you did it." Charlotte sat with that for a moment. "Thank you for still being there when he came back," she said. Marcus nodded. Once, they watched the rest of the show, in the particular comfortable silence of people who have more in common than they expected. Sophie performed third. She played a piece on the violin she'd been learning for 2 years, not flawlessly, because she was 8 and had been learning for 2 years, but with the particular focused commitment of a child who takes things seriously. The same commitment she brought to homework and to watching her father's face, and to writing on whiteboards in deliberate, careful printing. When she finished, she looked out at the audience and found her father in the third row, the way she always found him, with the unerring accuracy of someone who has always known exactly where he was. She smiled. He raised one hand. It was not a wave. It was just acknowledgement. "I see you. I'm here. I'm always here." She walked off the stage with her violin and her shoulders back, and her mother's eyes and her father's composure. And Ethan sat in the third row of a school auditorium and felt the fullness of a moment that contained everything, the grief and the gratitude, the loss and the continuation of it. The highway and the rain and the boardroom whiteboard, and Sophie's careful printing, and Charlotte's gray eyes finding focus in the dark. He felt it all, without flinching. That was the thing he'd learned, in the end. Not to resolve the feelings, not to organize them into something manageable, but to feel them fully and remain standing. To hold the weight of everything that had happened, Laura's death, and the years of invisible labor, and the night on I-40 and the morning of the clipboard and the meeting, and Marcus uncrossing his arms to hold all of it at once and not be crushed by it, because being crushed by it would mean stopping, and the only direction was forward. He had always known that. He just hadn't always believed the forward was going somewhere. He believed it now. After the show, in the school parking lot, Sophie ran out and found him immediately. And Marcus ruffled her hair with the easy affection of a man who had 3 kids of his own and knew how to be around them. And she tolerated it, the way she tolerated things she secretly liked. Charlotte stood slightly to the side, and Sophie looked at her with the direct assessment that had always been one of her defining qualities. "You're Charlotte," Sophie said. "I am," Charlotte said. Sophie looked at her for a moment. Then she said, "Are you going to keep giving my dad hard problems to solve?" Charlotte blinked. Then something happened in her face that was rare enough to be remarkable, a real, unguarded, complete smile. "Yes," she said, "I think so." "Good," she said. "He's better when he has something to fix." Then she turned back to her father and said, "Can we get pizza?" Ethan looked at Marcus. Marcus shrugged. He looked at Charlotte. "Pizza," she said, with the certainty of a woman who had made significantly larger decisions more quickly and was not going to agonize over this one. They went for pizza. It was the most ordinary thing in the world, and it was also the best thing that had happened in a very long time, which is usually how it works. The best things tend to be ordinary: a table, food, people who know your name and choose to be there, the laugh of a child who knows she is safe. The rest is just everything that leads you to the table. Ethan Brooks, who had once been a warehouse technician in a building that didn't know his name, who had driven home in the rain with a sleeping daughter and a cut on his palm, and no expectation of anything in return, who had stood at a whiteboard in a boardroom and spoken the truth with nobody but the truth backing him up, who had rebuilt a company from the floor upward with the same quiet completeness he'd always brought to everything. That man sat at a pizza table on a Tuesday evening in December and looked at the people around him and understood, without needing to say it, that this was what it had all been moving toward. Not the title, not the salary, not the Category 1 classification, or the quarterly metrics, or the 61% reduction in turnover. This, the table, the people, the ordinary extraordinary fact of being seen. He had done the right thing when no one was watching. And now he was surrounded by people who had been watching all along, who had seen him in the warehouse and on the highway and in the boardroom and in the parking lot of a school, and had chosen, again and again, to stay. That was the whole story. That was all of it. One man. One decision. 3 seconds on a rainy highway. And proof, offered quietly and without fanfare, that a single act of genuine courage, the kind that asks for nothing and expects nothing and simply does what the moment requires, can change the direction of not one life but many. Can build something solid where there was only neglect, can turn the corner of an ordinary Tuesday into the beginning of something that lasts. Charlotte Bennett had said she'd invested in a man. She had been right, but she had also, without meaning to, invested in everyone that man touched, and everyone they touched in turn, and the ripple of that investment was still moving, would keep moving, in the lives of warehouse workers whose names nobody used to know, and a 12-year-old girl who'd learned roll, and a man with 12 years of floor knowledge, finally wearing a title that fit, and a woman who had learned to cry again and wasn't afraid of what that meant. Ethan Brooks reached across the table and cut Sophie's pizza into the 4 pieces she preferred, the way he had done every pizza night for 5 years. She didn't say thank you. She didn't need to. Some things are simply understood between people who have learned to trust each other completely, the small daily faithfulness that adds up over time to a life built on something real. He picked up his own slice. He ate. He was home.